Hey everyone, welcome to Strange Stories, where we explore near-death experiences and supernatural stories from people who've had a glimpse of the other side. If you enjoy our content, please consider liking the video and subscribing to our channel. Without further ado, let's get to the story of the day. It has been 2.5 years since my NDE and OBE, and while I don't dwell on them, they're never far from my mind's eye. I don't consider myself to have had a typical NDE with all the bells and whistles connected, and after reading some of the more terrifying tales posted on your website, I'm glad I didn't. But here goes for what it's worth. My near-death experience occurred during an angioplastic operation. On May 20, 1996, I suffered my 4th heart attack. The emergency endoplasty saved my life at the time, but more operation was required. The additional work was completed a few months later, on September 6. The implantation of 2 coronary artery stents proceeded smoothly. I recall the doctor informing my husband, jokingly, after the procedure that I would be back at work the following Monday. However, once I was returned to my room, something went wrong, and I had another heart attack. I was rushed back into the catheterization lab for another round of angioplasty. I'd been under the knife for what felt like hours, and despite the medicines, I was in excruciating pain. Nonetheless, the prospect of death never occurred to me. I had good faith in my doctor's abilities, as well as my own invincibility. I felt a bizarre electrical pop resonate throughout my body, beginning in my heart, near the end of this current round of angioplasty. I was paralyzed, unable to move, breathe, or even shift my field of vision. I remember being terrified because I couldn't breathe. I knew I had to. I desperately wanted to, but I couldn't, and there was no agony. I could only get glimpses of the medical team striving to save me since I couldn't move my eyes. My doctor's fist was rising and falling as he beat my chest. I could even hear the contact's empty thudding sound, but I felt nothing. It sounded like something crashing through water, underwater. It was an odd sensation. I felt like I was floating outside of my body. I realized I was dying sometime during the seconds that seemed, and still do, like an eternity. My vision was diminishing, as was my awareness of what was going on around me. Before everything turned dark, all I could feel was worry for my family and grief that I would never see my husband and sons again. I didn't want to die, and I didn't want to abandon them. My children still required my assistance. Suddenly, a sensation of serenity washed over me, and I got engrossed in the events unfolding around me. In addition to what the physicians and nurses were saying, I could hear what they were thinking in my head. I was astounded by my capacity to see as soon as this weird occurrence began to sink in. It was seeing, but it didn't have eyes. It was a perception that extended far beyond the occipital lobe. With my eyes closed, I could see my comatose body below, and everyone was feverishly working on me. My OBE-based visual impressions differed from normal vision in the following ways. Number 1, everything was razor sharp. The colors were vibrant, and the edges were razor sharp. I could see faraway objects as if they were right next to me. I recall seeing something down the corridor as though it were a foot distant. Normally, I have to wear big glasses to see anything at all. I have terrible myopia and have had it since I was a toddler. I've even given up driving because of my terrible vision. But here I was, not only seeing sharper details than I'd ever seen before, but also seeing in all directions at once, comparable to a 360-degree panoramic view. I know it seems like I'm lying or insane, but I saw the holes in the soundproof ceiling tiles and the detailed pattern in the floor tiles at the same time, with only the slightest shift in vision. I knew how many holes were in the ceiling tiles, though it was just a feeling and I didn't stop to count them. One of the fluorescent lights was humming loudly, and I noticed it. On the end of one of the lights, I could even read numbers and some lettering. I simply remember seeing 3 letters at the end of it. ULV. I floated out of the room and spotted several other persons in the hall who looked like me. I approached one of the men and spoke with him, He was agitated and inquired as to why he was there. I told him I didn't know and that we might both be killed. And when he heard this, he looked surprised. His eyes became huge and he ran off, or should I say floated off in a haste, seeking to find the morgue. I suggested he check out the basement. I didn't think to ask for his name, but in retrospect, I wish I had. He appeared to be around 70 years old, with gray hair. I remember chuckling somewhat as he turned to leave me, and I noticed his tiny bottom poking out from beneath his blue medical gown. I continued along the corridor, making passing comments to folks who were likewise out of body. They all appeared to be disoriented and searching for their bodies. I didn't care what was going on with my body at the time, but I was interested whether my husband and sons were present. So I went into what I assumed was the waiting area and found my husband and 2 of our 4 sons. They were pacing the floor and spoke to one another. My youngest son was in tears. I wondered if my 2 young children, ages 8 and 10, were with my mother. But before I could think about it, my mother came through the front door, and I could see her while I was watching my husband and sons in a different room. She was inquiring where to go to the waiting room, and I was in 2 places at the same time. I noticed the clock on the waiting room wall read 4:07 p.m. That was something I took a mental note of. The next thing I recall seeing him do is convulse on the table, gasping and clawing for air. I was in excruciating pain throughout my body. I'm not sure how or why, but in the midst of my fight for survival, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd been pushed back into my body, partially against my will, by some force, somewhere. Only that I knew I wasn't spending time in my body, that I was a different portion of my body and a thinking individual with their own personality and memories. And here I was, back in this other hideous shell known as my body, in excruciating anguish. I recall thinking that this could be how it feels to be born. I was able to bring back a few tidbits of proof from my trip. As soon as I could, I checked in with my mother, husband, and sons, and was told that, yes, my husband had arrived before my mother with my 2 oldest sons, and they were waiting in the waiting area for me. My mother also dropped off my 2 youngest children with my neighbor before racing off to join my husband and the other 2 children in the waiting area. Her arrival time was approximately 4:07 p.m. Although it was difficult to obtain assistance from busy nurses, I later discovered that an elderly guy who was 74 years old named James Randall had died earlier that day in hospital rooms 2 doors away from mine. He fit the description of the befuddled soul looking for his body. I would assume that our meeting began around 10 minutes before I noticed the clock in the waiting room. All I could get out of the nurses was that he died in the early afternoon and had a stroke. To date, I've made a full recovery from my cardiac issues. The heart damage I sustained throughout the episode has caused me to slow down and reflect before doing anything. This is challenging given that I have 4 busy boys, but I am now a full-time mother to my sons and hopefully a better wife to my husband. I expect to live a long life as long as I take my prescriptions. I'm no longer terrified of death. I know there is no pain, and when the time comes, there may even be a sense of release from pain, peace, tranquility, and the start of a new experience. I don't have any exceptional visions, psychic or healing powers to report, and I'm no closer to being a saint than I was before my NDE or OBE. But I can tell you this, I feel a lot better about what's going on in my world. However, I do occasionally become engrossed in the world, and I find myself reverting to my old type A mindset. But I always return to the sense of serenity and clarity I felt when I was in the hospital. After the worst was past, I had a vague sensation of knowing who we are, why we are, where we came from, and where we're heading. I'm a fervent believer in the existence of a soul that may and does separate from our bodies. Nobody ever told me I died that day. Thus, my experience was most likely not an NDE. But even if it was, I wouldn't be scared.